Hello, I'm Faisal Pervez, a South Asia analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, the world's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
In the Cartels case, they're not really trying to take over Mexico. They don't want to govern because it's expensive, it's a hassle. They just want to be free to conduct business the way they want to conduct business.
Welcome to the Stratfor Podcast. I'm Fred Burton. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Stratfor's VP of Tactical Analysis, Scott Stewart. Scott, you recently published an intriguing article for us about Mexican drug cartels. Are cartels terrorist organizations?
Well, they can be, and I think historically we've seen groups like Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. They were true narco terrorists. They were involved in terrorist activities such as bombing markets, bombing the domestic intelligence agency, taking down planes and vice presidential candidates and such. So that was real terrorism. The Mexican cartels are very brutal. They use a lot of military grade weapons. They use explosives. They decapitate people. They cause terror, but they cause terror for economic gains and not for political gains. So I don't really consider it to be the same type of terrorism like what we saw out of Escobar's group.
And I know because we looked into a lot of those bombings back in the day in Bogota. Yeah,
absolutely. Mike Parks and I traveled down there and looked at a couple of the bombings that Escobar's people did in Bogota. So, our Stratfor staff here has direct knowledge of what narco terrorism looks like.
And certainly have picked up the pieces of many buildings and rubble. So if you look at how cartels are different from terrorist organizations, what would you think would be one or two kind of the big differences? Because I know we get a lot of readers and writers and a lot of comments on social media about Mexican cartels being terrorist organizations. So what do you think is the biggest differentiator?
Well, it's really the fact that they're not politically motivated. They're economically motivated, and why they do try to use terror, it's for commercial purposes, not for political purposes. And when we look at terrorism, it's really on that kind of that militant continuum, we'll call it, where you have kind of terrorism leading into insurgency, leading into conventional warfare. It's really seen as a continuation of really warfare. In the cartels case, they're not really trying to take over Mexico. They don't want to govern because it's expensive. It's a hassle. They just want to be free to conduct business the way they want to conduct business.
So the difference would be an economic indicator there.
Yeah, the motive.
The motive behind that.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about the geography of Mexico and how it helps make it possible for cartels to thrive.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've had a monograph of Mexico on our Stratfor website for many years now. And, really when you look at Mexico's geography, the vast, really it's a very expansive country, but then you also have a lot of geographic barriers that have always kind of made it difficult for Mexico City to exercise control over kind of the remote reaches. So you kind of have this core of Mexico, which is really the plateau where Mexico City is. But then as you get out, into the mountains and the deserts of the north, there's kind of that separation, or also going south the other way with, the jungle and rainforest to the south and some of the mountains. It's been very difficult historically for them to exercise control. And so, the places where we've seen, these organized crime groups kind of evolve, the mountains of Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, north of the desert, on the U.S. border, or even down in Tierra Caliente. Those have always been kind of places where there's been banditry and where the government's had a problem exercising control.
And I know for our listeners that have not seen our cartel map that shows the different patches of turf which are owned by what cartel, is one thing that we consistently get a lot of good feedback. So I would encourage our listeners to take a look at that map. If you're doing business or traveling in Mexico and you want to see which cartel is in what area, that's a good place to look. Our creative team is, I think, for 15 years now, done a great job with that. Scott, What counterinsurgency tools are being used against cartels?
Well, let's take a step back first and kind of look at the counterterrorism tools, and that's where we talk about that the cartels aren't really terrorists, and the Mexican government and the U.S. government hasn't categorized them as terrorists like they did Pablo Escobar. But we see a lot of the same tools and counterterrorism tools being used against the cartels. So you have these special forces raids coming in to either capture or kill people. We had the Beltran Levarado brothers get captured and killed. We had El Chapo get swept up. We saw the military attempt a few years ago to get El Mencho, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the leader of the CJNG, and they actually had their helicopter shot down by the CJNG guys with an RPG. So, I mean, there really is a lot of, warfare going on there. We also had a senior Beltran de Alva organization figure get taken out in Tepic with a helicopter gunship with a minigun. And it was just orbiting, and there was all this social media feed of this helicopter just orbiting and just raining fire from you could just see the tracers pounding that building. And it really looked like something that you would expect to see from Iraq or Syria in a raid against an Islamic State compound or Al-Qaeda compound. So we've seen these tools. We've seen intelligence tools, trying to hack and track the electronics of these cartels. So a lot of the same tools we see used against the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda have really been turned against the cartels. But the problem that we have there is that despite all of this, the Mexicans have not been able to kill their way out of this problem.
Yeah, that's a very interesting line. I know you've used that before when you say that Mexico can't kill their way out of this violence and this problem. And I think that if you look at that, too, from a terrorism perspective, it's a lesson we also learned from that for many, many years now.
Yeah, and really, I mean, when we see these decapitation strikes that they've taken, and whether it's taking out Osiel Cardenesquian, out of the Gulf Cartel, or taking down, Guzman, El Chapo Guzman out of Sinaloa. What that's really done is help foster really this what we call balkanization. So there's been this splintering of the cartels due to these operations, but they're still there. And in many ways, it's really just increased the violence because, for example, if we look at Tamaulipas, you used to have the Gulf Cartel pretty much in charge of all the smuggling in Tamaulipas. They were the big dog. They controlled everything. But now, the Gulf Cartel totally imploded. You had Los Zetas splinter off. Then they fractured further into probably at least half a dozen Los Zetas factions. And then the Gulf Cartel itself now is all little, micro factions of the Gulf Cartel. They call themselves the Gulf Cartel, but I mean, there's currently 2 Gulf cartels, quote unquote, in Reynosa that were, splinters of this organization called Los Metros that are fighting for Reynosa. And that's what's creating a lot of the bloodshed there, has been just that increased friction as you've had, these groups splinter and fight against each other, plus against their opponents. So there's just a lot more levers or layers of violence now. And that's why we're seeing these record levels of murders in Mexico. And so just, trying to kill the way out of the problem, trying to take out the leaders, really hasn't solved the underlying problems that has caused, the violence and the rampant violence in Mexico.
We'll get back to Stratfor's Fred Burton and Scott Stewart's conversation on cartels and counterinsurgencies in a moment. If you like the content of today's discussion, Stratfor Worldview is chock full of geopolitical content on topics like security, cybersecurity, the global power competition, Brexit, and more. To subscribe, visit worldview.stratfor.com. Now, back to the studio.
Do you think the kingpin strategy works there, Scott? Meaning if you capture an El Chapo, does it really matter?
The thing is, economically, no. Because we know that there's going to be the flow of drugs, because as long as there's a demand in the U.S., and as long as Americans are willing to pay big money for these poisons, somebody's going to find a way to smuggle them across. And whether that's a large organization, like what was the Guadalajara cartel that broke down, or what was the Gulf cartel that broke down, or whether it's these fragmented, little micro cartels, somebody's going to move it. And really, I think it's also interesting to understand that when we look at the border, that's like that invisible line. Well, there's a fence or a river in some places.
Right.
But really, there's a very big difference in the way these organizations operate on either side of that line. And they're the same groups. We know that these Zeta groups, these Gulf cartel groups, these other groups, Sinaloa, come up into the U.S., but they behave very differently on the north side of the border than they do on the south side.
And explain the reason why.
Well, basically the reason why is because there's a rule of law, in the U.S., whereas in Mexico, we just have this rampant corruption. There's impunity. You can literally get away with murder in Mexico. There's really a vacuum of governance and capable governance, and then the people don't trust the government. And so all those things have really allowed the Mexican cartels just to run amok south of the border. And so that's why they behave differently. Now, do we have corruption in the U.S.? Absolutely. We've seen everybody from local sheriffs, deputies, and sheriffs to FBI special agents in charge arrested for cartel corruption. So it's there, but it's viewed differently on the U.S. side. It's not nearly as pervasive. And on the U.S. side, basically, it's rooted out and these guys are taken down. Whereas in Mexico, it just continues and it really impacts every layer of government. And it just really, not only helps the cartels in their illegal activities, but it also really has, caused the public to lose their confidence in government down there.
How do you address the issue, though? I know when we talk to the Mexican government officials on visits or at conferences and so forth, they certainly put the blame squarely back on us, meaning, look, if America did not have this drug demand problem, we would not have some of the violence. How do you address that issue?
Well, I think, again, just compare Texas to Tamaulipas. Okay, they're basically, especially South Texas, you look at the Rio Grande Valley, there's very, very little difference on the north and south side of the river as far as geography, culture, other things.
Family.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much the same families on both sides of the river in many cases. But there's a huge difference in the levels of violence. So, South Texas still has the problems of dope flowing through there.
Sure.
Basically almost all the dope that's flowing through Tamaulipas is coming through the Rio Grande Valley.
Right. And so is stolen cars and stolen weapons.
Yeah, and the money and the guns coming south are also coming through Texas and going into Tamaulipas. But it's totally different. So you just can't blame the drug flow alone. You can't blame just the money or the weapon flow alone, because otherwise it would be the same in southern Texas as it is. It'd be the same in Brownsville as Matamoros, and it's not. So it's not just that flow. It really is the idea of governance, of stability, of accountability, lack of corruption.
It seems like we've been talking about cartel violence and as long as we've been at Stratfor. And certainly when we were with the State Department, we were dealing with issues there too. For example, the kidnapping and murder of the DEA agent. Are we making any strides in this so-called war on drugs? Meaning, how do you define success here? What is the answer when it comes to this issue, and what should America's role be in that?
Well, I think America definitely has to help support the Mexicans, but it's something that they ultimately have to solve themselves. We can't solve it for them, and that's something that the United States needs to understand. We can support them and be partners, but it's really something they have to do themselves. At the same time, when we're talking about defining success, I think success would be getting violence down to a similar level of what it is in Texas from the cartels. If the Mexicans could get the cartels to behave in the same manner they do in Texas and Mexico, that'd be a huge win. I mean, it'd be a huge win not just for society, who they're bearing a lot of this brunt, but for business. Because these cartels are involved in oil theft, cargo theft, extortion, kidnapping, carjacking, all these crimes that are impacting Mexican businesses and their families and businessmen and their families. So if they could get those things under control, it would be a huge boon for the Mexican economy.
Where do you see this going? We are strategic forecasting, so if you had to sit back and look out, say, 3 to 5 years from now, where do we see this cartel violence heading?
Well, sadly, as we've been watching trends and as we project them forward, if the Mexican government keeps doing what they've been doing and pursuing basically the approach they've been pursuing, I don't see it getting any better. The violence is going to continue. There's really nothing right at this point that's going to stop groups like the CJNG in their efforts to push to take over these plazas. So a lot of the violence we see today, whether it's in Tijuana whether it's in the Juarez and Chihuahua City area, whether it's even the stuff in Reynosa. It's a lot of those are the CJNG working with kind of local partners and supporting them in those wars because they don't really haven't up to this point controlled the plaza themselves. So they've had to pay other people to smuggle their drugs, and that's expensive. So that's why it's worth them going and trying to basically conduct these wars against competing cartels so they can own a plaza, they can move their stuff through there freely without having to pay what they call a piso or a tax on moving their contraband through there. So they're very, very much involved. I just don't see the dynamics ending. I don't see these small wars between these smaller groups, whether it's in places like Reynosa, or whether it's what we see happening in Guanajuato, Guerrero State, where Acapulco is located, is the same way. You just have all these micro cartels there fighting each other for turf to grow, opium poppies, but also for drug sales and retail drug sales in Acapulco and other places. So there's just multiple levels and layers of violence there. And I don't see that ending if they keep pursuing the same approach they pursued. And that's why I wrote this piece talking about trying to switch gears and move into more of a counterinsurgency type model.
If you're looking out at the Mexican cartel's relationship with just global organized crime, are we seeing Mexican cartels' interactions with organizations such like the Italian mafia or Chinese organized crime?
Oh, absolutely. If you look, there's very, very strong connections between China and Mexico. And that's taken a form in the way of drug precursors. So almost all the precursors that are coming into Mexico's super labs to make these tons of methamphetamine and to make the fentanyl and sometimes finished fentanyl, that's all coming in from China. On the other hand, we also see Mexican organized crime working with biker groups in Australia to sell cocaine, to sell methamphetamine and other drugs there. I believe eventually we're going to see fentanyl headed that way from Mexico on those same. And then, of course, we see the Mexicans working in Europe, with organized crime over there. So they really have become a very big global player and do have, a very big footprint right now.
Who do you think is winning? Are the cartels winning or is the Mexican government winning?
Well, it depends how you describe winning. And that's the problem. Certainly, the cartels are continuing to make a lot of money. They're losing high-profile individuals, so that can be counted as a win by the government. So if you take somebody like El Chapo Guzman off the street, okay, that's a win, but it didn't really stop the flow of contraband, and certainly didn't stop the violence. And so, I think that if we start thinking about, kind of rationally, what we need to see, the Mexicans to really have a win is to be able to reduce the violence in Mexico, to a level where basically their public feels safe and where businesses can thrive. Because, just within the last week, we actually had a case where a very large Ford dealership in Guanajuato State closed down.
Right.
Because of the threat of extortion. We've seen Pepsi and Coke pull out of Guerrero State because of the chaos there, and it really is hurting business. The amount of cargo theft that's going on, oil theft in Mexico is just terrible.
And so that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that a lot of good folks lose their jobs, and so what are you going to do? But perhaps go into the drug trade.
Exactly. Mexico, the economy is doing surprisingly well considering these problems, but it could be even doing better. And it could really be providing opportunities for these young people that are going into this cartel lifestyle. Of course, it's more work than being a sicario. Doesn't probably quite pay as well, but still there would be a lot of opportunity there.
Scott, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Fred.
We'll have details about Scott Stewart's article on treating Mexico drug cartels as insurgents in our show notes. If you're interested in learning more about Stratfor Worldview, our premier publication for anyone interested in geopolitics and world events, be sure to visit worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. I'm always looking for tips for good interviews. You can send me ideas directly at podcasts@stratfor.com. I'm Fred Burton. Thanks for listening.